right, so we've moved across the room, and we have a different grouping of art behind us, which I do want to talk about, because there's some things back here I want to talk about. But before we do that, in between, during the break, we were having a conversation, we reiterated the conversation about the pie pans and the creation of worlds in the pie tins. And I want to go back to that, because you said something that I thought was really good, about dominion and about children.
Oh, well, think about what children have so little control over their own lives. And that's on purpose, right? They don't need to have a whole lot, they need to have some decisions to make, but not earth-shattering ones.
Right.
But they still, inside of them, have God's image. Mm-hmm. And we believe that as people made in God's image, those children do have that seed of having dominion over the earth and caring for it and wanting to create worlds, which is exactly what Adam and Eve are told to do, right? They're told to go out there and make something of all these raw materials. So children can only take the raw materials that they can find. And this is a good place where we should say, I don't want my children to grow up thinking that dominion, or that making, and by dominion, that can be a very fraught word. Right. So what we want to talk about that word. Caring, cultivating is how we want to talk about that. It's not oppressing, it's not strong-arming this world into doing something. It's about caring, it's about cultivating what's good in it. But I don't want children, and neither of us grew up thinking that art started at Hobby Lobby.
No.
Because we didn't get taken there, right? Like, I do remember going to some store where I got some paint, or I got like some craft supply, but usually I was digging through the trash. Usually I was stealing tape, right?
Yeah.
And so when children make these little tiny dioramas, I think they're doing exactly what they're cut out to do,
right?
As humans.
Yeah.
And they'll do that on a larger scale later, hopefully on a human scale though.
Right.
I think that we feel much pressure to do things on a bigger scale at a faster speed than humans were probably meant to do.
Right. My mother, we didn't have a lot of art in our home because we didn't have any money. We were poor. But my father was a landscape designer, and so as a result, there was this sense in outside of our home, like just the immediate area right outside of our house, we lived in a park. I mean, we had a park shelter, we had a garden. My father basically built a park in our yard, and I think for me, it went from like the pie pan to the yard, and the yard was like that next layer of world making. And then as a child, you read all the books that are all about new worlds, right? You read Magdalene L'Engle and you read C.S. Lewis, and those books sort of help you understand that whole idea of world making. The other thing I was thinking of while you were talking is the thing I often quote from Wendell Berry. He says that efficiency is not more important than care, which I think is something that is really, I think part of what your work is about is you're using objects that were created in sweatshops by efficiency in some of your work, not all of your work, and you're applying something that is recreating them as objects of care. Is that a good?
Yeah, well, and a lot of my objects that I use in my pieces, they did originate in a bad situation, right? Like they were probably made in a factory where if we would be honest enough to know what happened in that factory, we'd be appalled and we would be we'd be smitten, right? But the problem is that then those things are disposed of. I would hope that if someone is going to invest in a work of art where a lot of time and effort spent, that it's harder to throw it away. And honestly, like when people give me these textiles, a bag of doilies or a crocheted bedspread or something like that, they're giving them to me because they don't want to throw them away.
Right.
They don't even want to donate them to people they don't know. It's very hard to find this stuff at a thrift store. Right. Because people won't do that. So they will store it until they find the person.
Indefinitely, right?
Yes, yeah. And they feel a little guilty, but they think, well, you're going to make something out of it. So I think it's good. And I think that attests to people understand this is worth something. But I go to a thrift store and I try to find stuff that's been basically thrown out. Right. And recreate it into something valuable. So both of those things are at work, right? Things that people have discarded because they're factory made, things that they don't want to discard because they are hand invested, right?
Yeah, we have things like that in our house that my mother just can't get rid of, right? We always say, we just can't get rid of it, we can't get rid of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll see things like that at thrift stores, and I know you find them infrequently, as I do. And my question is always, who made these, right? Like, who made them? Whose grandmother did they belong to? And in my mind, I imagine the moment whenever the person puts them in the bag or the box and sends them off to the thrift store, and they have this like twinge or guilt.
Good.
Yeah, I know. And then I think, good, I can buy them.
Yes, yeah. But think about the fact that, so I have one piece up here on this wall. I've got a display, if you want to look at the social medias and see. I've got a display, and there's a number of pieces that are painted over doilies. And one of those pieces looks to me like it was factory made. It's still made by hand.
Right.
But even in the character of it, it looks like it was made under duress, honestly. There's not, some of these, there is no way that they could be made with that level of care and precision,
right,
unless the person was doing it for joy, honestly. And I don't think I'm reading into this, but there's one piece that, partly because it's from the 90s, it was just a bunch of other stuff just like it.
Right.
I think it was mass produced. But while I was, I try to work in batches when I'm prepping, and I was gluing all of these doilies down to these painted panels, and I thought that this one was made in a factory. But I thought also, all of these are anonymous, so I'm taking anonymous work by someone that made this probably for love and for joy, gluing that down, and I'm gluing down next to it a piece that was probably made just for pennies, right?
Yeah.
But both of them that work gets to be honored by both of them.
Right.
I'm really happy about that.
Yes, because the person who works in the factory is also making it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's still made by a person.
Yes.
And you're right, it was maybe made for only a compensation of pennies. But my thought is always, but it might have been made for the joy of being able to buy a child a pair of shoes or a meal.
Yeah.
Right? And so I did this work for weeks, then I was able to feed my family some fabulous meal because I did this work for several weeks.
Yeah.
And that's really lovely. And I think you're right, rather than throwing away those kinds of objects, how can we honor those materials as well? Right? I mean, you and I both shop at Goodwill. I find my pleasure in buying things at Goodwill that people consider fast fashion that have been in my closet now for 25 years. I had a girl come up to me one time at a store. It was very uncomfortable. And she commented on something I was wearing, and she was like, oh, I never buy anything that's fast fashion. It's just so cruel. And I looked at her and I said, well, if you wear it for 25 years, it's not fast fashion.
We're slowing things down.
Right, and I thought, because this thing you're commenting on, I've been wearing for 25 years. So for me, it's not fast fashion because I take care of it.
Yes.
I wash it, I mend it. I'll even mend my clothes from Ann Taylor or whatever, right? Just because I mess something up doesn't mean it goes to Goodwill.
Yeah. And we're not saying this to be purists. These are just like ideas in the art that we're trying to slow down, live at a human pace.
Right.
Live at a human pace even of consumption.
Yeah.
And build things back out into the world.
Yeah, and Goodwill is a great place to be able to.
We love it.
It's a great place to be able to do that. So one of the things behind us here is this sink, and Michelle has worked with another artist to create some pieces of pottery. And I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk about the infamous oven mitt behind there, because I think that's an interesting piece. But talk to us about the pottery that you have here behind us.
Well, I have a friend named April Schwingle, and she's a longtime friend. We talk together, we've done a lot of different things together, and one of the things that I discovered probably in the last year or so is the pattern and decoration movement. And these were artists that I'd seen their work. There's a big show, well, hopefully it's going to open back up soon, right? A big show called With Pleasure on the pattern and decoration movement. But one thing that we see with fine art, the women that were bringing craft into fine art to speak about women and about women's lives often painted on pottery. And so that's intrigued me, but also I have no desire to make pottery. I took one semester of it and it was fine, but it's just, you really have to commit on a whole level.
Right.
You don't just dabble in pottery and do a great job at it. I can't. So April had talked to me about, sometimes we should collaborate. And so, I thought, well, we might as well try this. So I wasn't even necessarily thinking that this stuff would be in the show. And I also didn't want, because the show is conceptual and because I'm trying to talk about the ideas, I didn't want to have the distraction of it being highly commercial, of being a shop, which is great for a potter to shop,
Right,
mostly in a shop, and I'm taking part in some pop-ups and things,
Yeah.
but I didn't really want that to be the feel. And we were actually just finishing some stuff up, and this was the week of the show opening. And I said, man, I wish we had a sink like that. We just throw all the pots in the sink. And my husband, Paul, when I mentioned that, he's like, let's just build it. So we ended up building a little counter and doing an installation. We resisted the urge to put ketchup on all of the pots. And so this was, the pottery was the only cash and carry item in the show. So people could come and take the work. The rest are going to get it after the show. But I don't know, it was kind of fun to set up an installation, and we didn't know where it would go, but it worked out really well to have it in front of the stained glass. I was going to put it off to the side, but with some help of friends and husband, we realized, honestly, having it in this context in front of a gigantic stained glass window, usually a sink's in front of a window.
Right.
I think to make us feel less claustrophobic.
Yes.
But I love that fusion. It might even seem a little bit comic, but I do love that this is in a space where the sacred and the secular don't have any choice but to collide, right?
Right. Which is very theatrical. We were talking about that at the beginning, having a show in a church, and then having like a domestic sort of women's work, what we think of as women's work show in a church is a very interesting clash of ideas. Also, I want to stand in the sink and look at Jesus.
He's looking at you.
At my house. That would be really wonderful.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very performative quality. I hate to use that phrase, but it is. There's a performative quality to that.
Yeah, for sure.
That you, as the viewer, are participating in the performance of the art in this space as well, not just the artist performing.
Because because the work was for sale, I had people are all coming up and touching the dishes at the sink.
Because you can't touch anything else. Right?
Yes, exactly. Though I told people, I would be okay with it. During the pandemic, everything's been digital, which is really not okay.
Not okay.
And so I just thought if they want to wash their hands super good so the oils are off their hands.
Yes. Go ahead and touch it, right?
Touch the art, because you haven't been able to touch it with your eyes.
Right.
But I love that people came in and just were like basically doing the dishes during the show. You would hear these clinks, oops, people are clinking the dishes and stuff. That was very satisfying.
That's very well, and like we said, you get to participate. And you're right, we have this grand lacuna of lack of participation in the world of touch right now, and in the world of experiences. There is something about that makes us want to engage and touch everything. Go ahead.
Well, and even having something that's not a flat rectangle, for art to me is very satisfying. I don't know what it is, but we are trained. I don't know if it's as Americans or what, but I do think that in general, people feel much more comfortable buying something that's been made into a flat rectangle, especially with a frame around it.
Right.
Not so comfortable with any other shape being art. So even though, this might not seem very fine arty to have mud or to have a usable object, I do kind of like that we're transgressing a little bit by blending those together through the installation in the context.
Yeah.
Pretty happy about
and I was going to ask you about that. You've mentioned the fact that the pottery and the painting is a little subversive. And in what way is that subversive? The idea that the fine art and the practical are converging.
Well, I mean, there could be among some artists a feeling of like, we're not going to paint on pottery. We're not going to make something that attainable or that, it's an object that's thought of as somewhat commercial.
Right.
And I guess I just think, I've watched my mother and my grandmothers and my father make objects that were used in our home, and I just don't have a problem with something that as long as I can infuse enough care into it to where I feel like I'm giving something to someone that I think is my best work. To me, that's the line. Is it your best work or not?
Yeah, okay, so there are these photographs, you just made me think of these photographs from the 1930s that are very famous, and they're part of a series of, some are social documentary photographs, some of them are commercial. But there's one particular photographer, Bernice Abbott, who was a little controversial because she was a bit exploitive of her subject. of her subjects and of her subject matter. But one of the things that she did that was very famous, I mean, you have to understand, this is the beginning of mass culture, right? She's taking photographs of factories, and she's photographing women making spoons, and women sewing flags, and all of this was supposed to be documenting American creation, right? Like, we know we're poor, right? We're in the Depression, but look at all this stuff that we're making, and we're making it in repetition, right? Those photographs have always struck me as really powerful, probably not for the reasons that Bernice Abbott wanted them to be, or that the publishers of Life and Time wanted them to be. But they've always struck me as really beautiful because those spoons, I see those spoons, and I think those spoons went to somebody's home. And somebody treasured those spoons, right? Because there wasn't a lot of excess. And so they purchased, these were silver spoons, right? This is nice service, right? And they're being stamped out in a factory, but they're being cared for inside of someone's home. And that, I think, is really an interesting juxtaposition, contrast, is that these, and I already mentioned this before, this idea that these mass-produced objects can be cared for. So these, right, so you buy a mug, right? And of course my first thought would be, oh no, I don't want to break the mug. Right, but the breaking of the mug is just part of the life of the mug. Right? It's not the beautiful painting hanging in the Louvre. It is this piece of fine art that I get to use every day, like these mass-produced spoons, that I get to take care of. That to me is really dominion and care, right? Is that there is repetition in nature, and that we still are supposed to care for the repetition in nature.
You know, that made me think the part about the factory. Okay, so it might seem like that kind of repetition is very different from the repetition of making a doily.
Right.
But one kind of, okay, so I don't even know how I'm thinking about this, but there's repetition leading to quantity, and there's repetition leading to a kind of quality.
Right.
You'd have to double up on both of those if you wanted to have quantity and quality.
You really would,
right? But then there's also repetition of use. Which requires care. So when you're turning fast fashion, which was a repetition of quantity, you're using a repetition of care, and you're actually reducing quantity of what you consume, right? So it's interesting to see how that kind of interaction moves the numbers, but also if you have a repetition of quality, I think that you'll keep it for long. You can keep it for longer usually.
Right, and there's something that redeems the form itself when you do that, right? So that the mug, I mean, and you made the comment your favorite mug is like a Hallmark mug.
It is, it's shaped like a bunny. It is, that the mug itself is a bunny.
Right, which is like a mass-produced product.
But I got it at the thrift store.
But you got it at the thrift store, but even if you bought it at Hallmark, there is this sense of what you're saying, this repetition of care that creates memory out of it. It's a memory, and your daughter and your sons will remember their mother's favorite mug.
Which I have to say, I bought it because I thought my kids would like me to watch me drink out of it, but I also am a sucker for bunnies, so it's there for sure. It's probably right because it's stoneware.
As they always do, right? And so then like the mugs and the dishes sort of become that way, right? You're not buying, you're buying their unique things. But that the form itself, the dish, right? We don't use a dish and then toss it. Most people don't. I don't know people who do that.
But people do use a dish and toss it when the next trend comes.
That is true. That is true.
You know,
right?
Which you'd never do that if it. I don't think that you'd do that as easily if you knew it had been handmade.
Right.
You'd either sell it, give it, or donate it.
Right.
I would hope.
But I feel like I have things that were passed down in my family from my grandmother or my great-grandmother that were mass-produced objects that I value really highly, only because my grandmother used them and took care of them.
And you probably have memories
Yes.
of her using them.
Yes.
I was so surprised at I sensed by just how people talked about the objects here, the antiques and the linens and the things they saw. I remember leaving one of the days and thinking there is a deep, deep memory in childhood. The objects you see in childhood, you have these deep memories that you don't know you have them until you see them again.
Right.
And one of my favorite things was people would come through and they'd walk over to me and they would say, that piece over there, I can't talk about it right now.
Mm.
So they couldn't find the words, but they also
Right.
knew that they would just kind of lose it.
Yeah.
And I thought, like, that's not just because like Jill's weird arts. It's because there's some sort of deep memory,
Right.
right, that they didn't realize they had.
Yeah, and that can be confused with like sort of cheap sentimentality or sort of like an empty nostalgia. But I think what that really, I mean, from my perspective, what that is a deep connection to some place and some people in a place.
And usually care.
Yes, and the
Associated.
care taken of that place.
Yes.
Yeah, and I love that idea that we don't always have to have fine things in order to have good things.
Yeah.
Right? Or we don't have to have fine things in order to have beautiful things. We need to have things that are just cared for
Yeah.
in order to have beautiful things.
Yeah.
Because some of my very favorite things are ugly things that have just been cared for
Yeah.
repeatedly over
Right.
and over and over again.
Yeah.
And things that I've repaired or things that I've washed over and over and over again.
Yeah. And that's it's very nice to see, like mending movements.
Right.
That people are honoring these old like borrowed textiles that have just been remended and remended.
Right.
And we're seeing those now as art. But they were
just practical.
they were just trying to wear clothes, right?
Exactly.
And now we're mimicking that with our like rich jeans.
My grandmother told a really good story about my grandfather, whom I never met. He died when my mother was young. And when they lived in West Texas, he was a cowboy, and he went on the cattle drive, and he was a teenage boy. And he probably went for like a summer, a season, whatever the season was, and he went as the cook. And when he went on the cattle drive, he had on a pair of jeans, and when he came back from the cattle drive, the jeans had been cut on the side, along the side, and been laced together with leather laces, because he had grown out of his jeans.
He had to guess it.
Isn't that great? I mean, it's almost scandalous, but it's also sort of wonderful that what were they going to do on the cattle drive? Stop by the Levi store and buy a new pair of jeans?
All
Get a
the
new pair of
parts were
leggings?
covered.
No, it was like they had leather laces.
Yes.
They fixed up,
Substitute.
right, they fixed up the teenage boy's jeans so that he wasn't dropping out of his jeans.
Yes.
Anyway, it's just kind of a good story. Okay, so tell us about the oven mitt, because I think it's interesting how you started making those.
Oh.
Or when you made that.
Oh, I better remember. You know, I rely on the collective memory of my husband and friends to tell me what my work's about, because I'll be making it and I'll totally forget how I started this stuff, you know what I mean? I think that this piece grew out of another one that's beyond the camera. I started cross-stitching with that very first, give me leave to do my utmost. I wanted to have other ways of making words, so I started cross-stitching these pieces, and during the whatever we call it in South Carolina, were we really on a lockdown? I don't know, but during
At least for 2 weeks.
yes, so during March, right, I realized basically I'm going to be at my house, or I'm going to be like at my mom's house.
Right.
Like that's pretty much it. So at some point in that thing, I decided I needed something that I could do that was repetitive.
Yes.
So, I want to talk about this real quick.
Okay.
Okay, there is a book called Women's Work, the first 20,000 years or 10,000, and it's a fantastic book that talks about weaving primarily,
Right.
and textiles made by women. It's an archaeologist. And
Oh
instead
yes,
of-
I remember this.
yeah,
one.
it's so good. So instead of studying pottery, which is very durable, you cannot find very many textile fragments. They're not
It'll last.
readily available.
Right.
So you can get them certain places, right? The bottoms of bogs, for instance, and she talks about this. But anyway, she talks about why did women end up engaging with textiles and why did the weaving fall to them. So women had to find things that could be picked up and put down a lot because they're caring for children.
Right.
They have to have things that aren't super dangerous for children. They can't be, it wasn't as common to be a blacksmith because your children will fall into the fire.
Right.
So anyway, and could they stay home, with babies while they did it? So I needed something that I could pick up and put down, and stitching is that.
Right.
So I made this piece that's over here, you can't see it, and it says, "Fear not, I will help thee." I felt like we were all freaking out,
Right.
for
good reasons.
reasons. And I wanted to those were words that came back over and over to me. So I stitched them not just once in black, but over and over in white thread as well. So it's kind of hidden, but that's the kind of repetition I needed in my brain. So I was doing stitching again, and I really felt like there are these little phrases that are very affirming, and they can be seen a couple different ways.
Right.
And I felt like, I need strength to just do the repetition of housekeeping.
Right.
So this is an oven mitt behind us that I hand quilted, hand piece. Well, it's machine piece, but I did use a robot to piece it. But it's all, it's pieced by me and sewn by me, and then I stitched "I will make you strong" on it. And I just thought, we can kind of look down on like the little plaques and stuff that women have had, little verses and truisms that people have had around their kitchens, but like you have to keep going, So just like those phrases, like from "Where does my help come from?" That idea, I started to put onto some oven mitts. That's what that is. That was a pandemic piece.
Well, and I remember you saying to me, I think I'm gonna stitch on oven mitts. I think I'm gonna make oven mitts. And it was like this, that seems really kind of crazy. Maybe everybody will think that's a dumb idea, but I'm gonna do it.
Yes, I was gonna do it, but also I knew that it was, this piece did actually sell, by the way, but when you're making something and selling it as art, you do have a certain price point that art would be at this size with this amount of investment. But because we're only used to seeing oven mitts that have been made by someone who is not getting paid fairly at all, out of materials that are not fairly priced, we are used to paying you can get one at the dollar store, right? So if you have an oven mitt that's $180, it feels so outsized, right? But what can I do, right? Nobody has to buy it. But I felt like, it was fun. We kept talking about, like, is someone going to use this? My husband called, someone going to use this? And I said, well, that's up to them.
It's up to them.
But they will have to choose whether they're going to use it. I can't afford to use it. I have to put it in the shadow box. But the form is the content. Right. So I'm not going to not have that be an oven mitt just so that I can make a sale. The form is the content. So deal,
Yeah, the other thing that strikes me as
subversive.
Yes, is this very sort of standard. You go to the Brooklyn Museum of Art. Is it the Brooklyn Museum of Art where Judy Chicago's table is? That's so stunning. And you see some of that kind of work, right? And you see a lot of feminist work that is really conceptual, and it's message driven, and it's really fascinating, and it says things that are very empowering. And this is almost like that on this totally different scale. That's how it strikes me, right? Is this sort of traditional feminist piece that strikes me as like a message, right? I will make you strong, but it's on something that is typically so derided, right? This object that's so derided.
But I feel like I'm also subversing that. To be clear, I'm subverting the subversion.
Yes.
Because I am not in this piece, whether you like it or not, saying Michelle Radford, will make you strong.
Right.
I'm saying Jesus is standing right up here, and in my mind I thought, I kind of like that this is like a two-edged sword. Like, you might think I as a woman am saying I'm strong inherently, and that's just not my experience at all. I don't think of myself as a strong person, but I do think, well, I am looking for strength in God, who is making me strong. Right. So I think it can be seen as totally in line with that feminist work, but I'm actually like not saying that. So just.
And I remember that from our first conversation, and you were like, I think this is going to be really subversive. My plan here is to be very subversive. And I was like, I love that.
But it's also like fully wound into the home too. Right. Like I am not standing up and walking out of the home to say like, here I go being a strong woman. Right. Like I do believe, like when I look at my mother and my grandmothers and their grandmothers, like there is an unbelievable amount of strength in remaining in care, right? In caring for the people that are younger than you, but also caring for those grandmothers that are older than you. I mean, you have to have an unbelievable amount of strength. I can't find that here, like in me.
No, and I think the thing we often forget in our time, which is good. I mean, I'm super happy that I can vote and own property and go to school.
We're getting political.
Right. I mean, those are all really important things, clearly. That goes without saying. I shouldn't even have to say that. But that there's also the generations of women that have come before us that have given us these opportunities to do all of these things, and the amount of work that they've done. And I think about my grandmother owning a laundry, that she was strong because she washed other people's clothes. And that is like, man, my grandmother is the greatest example of a woman that I could achieve. And she was so proud of me when she was alive, and was so proud of the fact that I had an education, and died well before I finished my doctorate. Like that, she would celebrate that too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like all of those generations of women, and women that you and I have talked to, like our mothers, our grandmothers, and women that I've worked with, and asked them questions about what was it like when you were young? How did that feel? Like that is so, man, that it just makes me want to cry. Like I'm so grateful for those women. And the things that they did. And a lot of it involved baking and meal. You know, baking food and putting something in a crock pot. And also going to work. Right?
And a lot of times, and this is something that you pointed out to me, that the kind of repetition that we see in, you know, the decorative items that women have made, they sat down after a day of hard work on the farm. For me, that was my grandmother's hard work on a farm. Or maybe for some women it is hard work in a factory. For some women it's hard work teaching and caring for children, and some of it it's running a business. But they came home, and then what did they set their hands? So they did the repetition in the factory, in the home, in the whatever, repetition. They sat down and they were able to relax through these small repetitions to make these things that lasted.
And that's where it feels like meditation to me, and contemplation. Right? I mean, I'm with you during our weeks of isolation, and I live alone, so my weeks of isolation were very isolated. I made some things. I made a quilted jacket, but I also got some silly putty and some toys and some Legos, and those things were also like physical repetitions that helped my brain to quiet my brain during all of that, rather than just the repetition of another Netflix show. You know, like the repetition of something physical, or baking bread. I mean, why did we all bake bread? Because we needed that repetition, I think. That liturgical, contemplative, meditative expression that's so physical.
And I think that we had to have something that was real.
Yes.
Because everything had turned digital. And I hope that if this pandemic snaps us out of anything, it snaps us out of this illusion that we can somehow, that somehow the digital has replaced the physical.
Right.
That somehow not real, I mean, I'm not saying that we don't have real friends on the other side, but that somehow the non-physical, just the virtual, I hope that it snaps us out of thinking that is in any way replacing experience with that thing, the other senses. Right? The smelling the bread. Tasting the bread, touching it. While we see it, that whole experience.
Well, hopefully what will happen to us is we became disembodied, in many ways, but became and have become so much more focused on our bodies, in the sense that we are so much more concerned about our health, We're so much more aware of how we feel. So it was like we became disembodied in order to focus on our bodies. Hopefully will be like a really positive thing for us to think about long term. Which I think is what your work is in large part about. It's about embodiment, and not being disembodied. That the physical repetition and labor is really an important part of our lives.
And I was excited, is it bad to say, during the pandemic, I thought, this might actually help more people to understand work about the home and about family and about, because my work has always felt so marginalized, so fringy, that when that happened, I thought, now people cannot ignore the home. They can't ignore their family relationships, whether they live with them or not. They can't ignore the home, and so maybe it won't feel so rare to having work about it.
Which makes me wonder if that's part of the reason why you had so many people respond to the work in a way that maybe they wouldn't have responded a year ago. That maybe that sort of emplacement in their homes has sort of forced them to think about things that maybe they haven't wanted to think about, or are painful to think about because of past experiences. That is an interesting thing. Is there anything else you want to talk about your work that we missed? You want to comment on?
Well, no.
I feel like we've talked about a lot.
We talked about it around the room quite a bit. So, thank you so much for
You're
being
welcome.
willing to spend time. I knew that Erin, if she came, she could pull the ideas out of my head that I've forgotten about, and I'm always really happy to talk through my work with her. So
Yeah, it's always good to remember something from somebody else's perspective.
yes, yes. Yeah. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.